Hello and a very warm welcome. Is India facing an imminent economic slowdown? You're watching the big India Today Economists Roundtable, and I'll be joined over the next 1 hour by some of the sharpest economic minds in this country. I want to introduce first Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India. With us on this broadcast, Sajjid Chinoy, Chief India Economist, JP Morgan from Mumbai. With us also DK Joshi, Chief Economist, CRISIL. PC Mohanan has been in the news recently. He's the former acting chairperson of the National Statistical Commission. He opted out saying that the government is not releasing reports of data that they had collected. With me in the studio, Arun Kumar, economist and author, and Rajeev Dubey, managing editor of Business Today. Question number one on the Economists Roundtable: is India facing an imminent economic slowdown? Rajeev Dubey, I'll start with you. So there are multiple markers that have emerged over the last few weeks to suggest that we're heading towards an economic slowdown. Do you believe this to be true? And how strong a slowdown could this be?
Rahul, I do not just believe we are in, heading for a slowdown. We are actually in a slowdown. We've been in a slowdown for at least 3 quarters now. If you look at these quarterly numbers, and also if you look at the annual number, we've been in a decelerating, towards a slowdown since 15-16. So we are truly in a slowdown as of now. As I said when we discovered this about 2 weeks back, is that there were 4 engines in the economy, of which only 2 were working, which was public expenditure and consumption. And now that consumption itself has tanked, we are only on 1 engine of the economy, which also slowed down in the second half of the last fiscal.
Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, car sales have shrunk in the past 3 quarters. Fuel consumption is down to the lowest in 7 quarters. Power generation growth is the lowest in 5 years. Finished steel production is coming down. The industrial production index is at a 21-month low. GDP growth rate is coming down. Critics would suggest that India is in the middle of an economic slowdown and the government needs to emerge from its denial and accept the reality. How do you respond, sir?
So, if you keep in mind that a complex economy like ours, a lot of what you see today, these are effects of leads and lags that work out in the economy. I would like to point out that I think what we did acknowledge was that there was a slowdown in the fixed capital expenditure and the investment, and this itself happened because of some of the issues that we had in the build-up of excess capacity, which itself then creates has an effect on the demand side, because we have our corporates which are now still now have not reached 80% capacity. And also one important aspect that we should keep in mind is that an important structural reform like the bankruptcy code, which has an impact on the way in which we invest in the economy, the way in which actually credit is provided. It changes the credit culture. Some of these, there will be some temporary effects, but what I think we must keep in mind is that over the last 5 years there have been important structural reforms at the micro level and at the macro level. At the micro level, I just mentioned about the bankruptcy code. Also, we've been, we basically have taken care of some of the institutional plumbing or the governance plumbing that I talk about. For instance, to build capacity at the bottom of the pyramid, buying capacity, the fact that we've been using direct benefit transfers and we've done 6 lakh crores, 6 trillion rupees, out of which the savings is 1 trillion rupees itself. These are important micro level reforms. Together with that, when you combine and you take into account that inflation, which is a pernicious tax on the middle class and the bottom of the pyramid, which has indeed put purchasing power in the hands of the lower middle class and the middle class itself. When you put these together, you are looking at actually a situation where there is some effects of what has happened in the past, but I remain quite optimistic that going forward the effects of these will start showing up. Also, as I was mentioning, on the macro side, we've been following actually from the situation when we were in fiscal deficit, which was much higher, in excess of 5%. We've been following this path of fiscal prudence. We've been following the glide path, to meeting the FRBM targets. We also, if you look at the external sector, compared to when we were, for instance, in 2013, when we also were facing situations on both the fiscal and the external front, we actually are doing better.
So let's use that to build on this debate. The government will argue, Arun Kumar, that we're in the middle of a fundamental reset.
Let me summarize.
Long-term structural reform has been implemented over the last 5 years. It is showing a temporary slowdown, but the advantages will start to accrue in the months and years to follow. Do you agree with the principal economic advisor?
No. The reason is that we have two parts of the economy, the unorganized sector and the organized sector. It's the unorganized sector that got hit very badly when we had demonetization and then GST. I think everybody agrees on that. The data for the unorganized sector comes with a time lag. So what effectively the GDP growth rate is based on the organized sector. If you include the unorganized sector, the economy is already slowing down from the time of demonetization, And therefore, in a sense, it's the demand problem that is very important, because 94% of the workforce is in the unorganized sector. If their incomes fall, then the demand for agriculture falls, and therefore the prices in agriculture go down. So our inflation rate being low is because of the deflation in the agricultural prices, which was causing a crisis in the farm sector. Also, if 94% of the employment is hit, then you have an employment crisis. And when such a large demand falls, then what happens is slowly it affects the organized sector also.
Heading towards a slowdown,
so we have been in a slowdown.
Of a full-blooded
So we have been in a slowdown, and now the organized sector is also slowing down, because automobiles, etc., are not bought by the unorganized sector.
So you're saying that post-demonetization, it's the unorganized sector that took a hit first.
Yes.
Now it's the organized sector where the data is suggesting that the slowdown has hit the organized sector as well. Sajjid Chinoy, we've heard two contrarian points of view. Sitting where you are at JP Morgan, what's your view? Are we heading towards a slowdown? Are we in the middle of a slowdown? Or is this just a temporary blip before the economy takes off?
Good evening, Rahul. I think the data is quite clear that for a few months now we are in the midst of a slowdown. The reasons are not hard to see. We're being driven largely by consumption, and rural consumption was holding things up for a couple of years, but the terms of trade have moved very adversely against agriculture. Food prices have collapsed. Food inflation last year was less than 1%, whereas non-food inflation is above 5%. So from a farmer's perspective, the terms of trade was very adverse, and that's hurt rural consumption. What was holding consumption up was urban consumption, but ever since the NBFC shock and the ILFS shock last September, we've seen that the NBFC sector, which is 40% of the auto market, 40% of the housing market, has been hurt. And even though bank credit growth has picked up, the total flow of funds has come under some pressure. As a consequence, even urban consumption has been hit. So yes, there is some degree of stress, but I think we need to be careful here. Things are not as grave as some of the headline high-frequency data suggests, because there are some temporary and transient factors at play as well. I'll give you three. Number one, I think the government may have had to cut expenditure very sharply in the month of March to meet its fiscal deficit target. That has a knock-on impact on activity, but hopefully government spending normalizes when the new administration takes over. We've seen some of the surveys tell us that business investment sentiment has been affected because of political uncertainty, and that happens around the world before any election. So, if that uncertainty dissipates, in the next month or two, we should see sentiment pick up. And we're seeing idiosyncratic things like in the auto sector, there's a transition to a new emissions norm, and that's pushed prices up and hurt demand. So both things are true. We're in the midst of some slowing. It's not as acute as the headline numbers would suggest, because there are some transient factors at play which should reverse or normalize in the coming months. But I'll end by saying one thing, and this was the point made earlier. So far India has been relying largely on two drivers. Private consumption and government spending. We're seeing that there are limits to private consumption. we're seeing that given our consolidated fiscal deficit and our public investment needs, there really is not much space for government consumption. The singular focus, I think, of the next administration has to be one thing and one thing alone: revive private investment. We cannot have sustained 7% growth for the next few years without private investment, and that will take the next generation of both fiscal and financial reforms.
Okay, let Krishnamurthy Subramanian respond to that. One of the big failures of the Modi government of the past 5 years has been its inability on account of various factors to get private investment to kick off. We've still not fully utilized the capacities that were built. New investment hasn't come into play, and as a consequence, the moment consumption demand slows down, you're hit by a slowdown, and there's nothing that you can do about it. By the government's own revised GDP figures, economic growth, the GDP numbers are now down to 6.9% from 8.1% in 16-17, 7.2% in 17-18. Therefore, the government needs to accept that there is a slowdown. Is it because we're in the middle of an election, therefore you're not even willing to concede that the economy is indeed slowing down and there are real problems the new government needs to confront and deal with?
So, as Sajjid was rightly pointing out, before any electoral cycle in any country, investors typically do adopt a wait and watch mode. Once this uncertainty resolves itself, there should be definite pickup in the investment, and as you yourself were pointing out, and as I was mentioning earlier, some of these slowdowns in the investment are also because of changes that we are bringing in the economy, which are necessary. For instance, implementing the bankruptcy code is something that is extremely important. Because in order to be able to enhance the quality of credit that you bring, and that will definitely have some effect. Because remember, when you let's say in a regime when the bankruptcy code was not in operation, the capital budgeting need not have been as careful as it is now, because now corporates are faced with the prospect that if they do not get their capital budgeting projections right, they stand the risk of losing control of the company. Of course, anticipating that, therefore, they will be a lot more careful. What it will do then is that the quality of investment will go up. There will be some effect on the quantity. I think what we should make sure, there are a couple of aspects that I must point out to all market participants. We should not get consumed by the short run, number one. Number two, I think it is important not to get too driven by just what we see on the quantity. It is extremely critical also to look at the quality of the investments that are happening, and what are the structural changes that are happening in that. So keep that in mind. I think I would agree that the emphasis on investment is something that has to be placed, and I would also submit humbly that this has to bring in emphasis on some of the aspects of competitiveness that our industry also needs to focus on.
Okay, DK Joshi, do you agree with this wait and watch theory that from about the middle of March, India Inc. and everyone else has been in, let's wait and watch who's coming to power, then we'll take our decisions, and therefore the short-term numbers are looking bad because everyone's holding back all decisions till the 23rd of May. And once there is a government in place, then things will start returning to normalcy. Do you agree with this theory?
Well, I think at the very aggregate level, let me point out that there is slowdown in the economy, and it was visible a couple of months back when the GDP data for the third quarter pointed at 6.6% growth. And now, as far as the investment decisions are concerned, I think I would say that some factors have turned favorable for private investment. For instance, the companies have reduced their debt equity levels, which means that they can leverage going ahead. Also, I think we are seeing that the capacity utilization in some of the sectors have been consistently improving. So these are the positives, but I think I agree that the major headwind is the uncertainty. uncertainty is the biggest enemy of investment. And right now, even the business sentiment is low, as shown by the RBI survey. So I think despite capacity utilization improving, I think the industry will wait for this political uncertainty to be over before they start investing. I may just add one more thing, that that the IBC process, the NCLT process, apart from changing the behavior of the market participants, I think what it also does is, I think it releases the excess capacity in the system, because when the companies acquire firms under NCLT, they will focus on improving their capacity utilization rather than, I think, investing in new capacity. So I think temporarily, I think it does slow down investment. I think this would particularly be visible in the steel sector. I think over the medium run, I think there would be challenges of jobs, there will be challenges of inequality, but clearly I think three factors are turning positive, and they will play out over the medium run. One is that we will get some reform dividend. Until now, I think the GST process has been more of an headwind because it's getting streamlined. I think it will start paying off once I think the process is streamlined.
Okay,
and
Arun Kumar,
also
reform
deleveraging,
dividend,
as I mentioned,
that
I think
you've
once the
bitten
firms start
tough,
leveraging, I think we
bitter
will see
pellets. At some point in time in the near future, these bitter reforms will start yielding results.
So I'll make 2 points. One quick point is that investment doesn't suddenly take off. You know, when there's uncertainty, it leads to long term. So there's a time lag process. So what we're talking about is only the organized sector. We're not talking about the unorganized sector. And what GST has done is hurt the unorganized sector, even though it has been exempt from GST, you know, up to 40 lakh and up to 1.5 crore composition scheme. But they don't get input credit. They cannot give input credit. They are stuck with a reverse charge mechanism. So GST is faulty in design, not just in implementation. So we've had more than 700 changes, orders, etc. coming in the last 22 months. But I would say that even if that gets sorted out, the unorganized sector is unambiguously getting hit. For instance, you take a look at the pressure cooker industry. There, the chief of the pressure cooker industry said the demand is shifted from the unorganized sector to us. You look at the recent story from the shoe industry, and there also there are large number of small producers. Demand is shifting from them to the organized sector because they are the ones who are able to deal with GST. They get the input credit. The small guy doesn't get the input credit. So therefore, these structural problems are going to continue. And that's why my argument is investment takes time to revive. So if there's uncertainty and because of that investment is down, it's not just in March. It was already slowing down. Okay. And that's why and that will continue even after the new government takes place.
I'll just like to add one thing, that we are still decelerating. We haven't hit the bottom as yet. The second thing is that exports are not going to go up because there's a new government in power in the center, nor are private investments going to come up unless capacity utilization is improving, nor are people going to start buying just because there is a new government in power. So like Dr. Kumar is saying, there is a structural problem that we need to resolve. These things are going to take their own time to resolve.
Okay, so that brings me now to question number 2. Is it global factors or policies of the Modi government that are responsible for the economic slowdown? Let me put that question first to Dr. Subramanian, because if I see just as one metric, agricultural growth, we now have data to compare the performance of UPA2 with that of NDA2, and between 2009 to 2013-14, agricultural growth rate was 4.3%. That has now come down from 2014 to 2019 to an average of 2.9%. The likes of Mr. Chidambaram, Pranab Mukherjee and others in the UPA would argue that they did, even in UPA2, a better job than NDA2 when it comes to agricultural growth. Dr. Subramanian.
So let me first respond to your question on agriculture. I think all of us would actually be missing the point if we start comparing these numbers, because the issue actually is elsewhere. The key problem is, we've been focused so much on enhancing production, and we've done that. So we have a food economy which is, where the food production is growing at more than 3%, and we have a population that is growing at less than 1%. As a result, you have surplus. So the key aspect that has to be focused on is it's not the food production as much, but the marketing of the food produced, bringing markets to the consumer, to the producer in this case, which is the farmer. And that is where, if you look at the ENAM, and I do concede that there are improvements which are being worked on, but it's an attempt, to really bring markets. The problem has actually been, has been identified, and there's work that is going on in trying to bring that. The second aspect, there's a lot of research that shows that agriculture itself, what we financial economists think about as the risk-return trade-off in agriculture is quite adverse. The farmers, face a lot of risks, and especially downside risks, or what we call left-tail risks. Here's where I think some of the support that is being given, for instance, through the PM Kisan, because research here shows that when you take care of the downside risks that farmers face, that crowds in productive investment in the form of fertilizers, in the form of other inputs that go in, and thereby enhances productivity. Also remember that because the risk is so huge, you have to actually focus on making sure that the downside is taken care of. So we have to really work on, in the agriculture side, bring in a lot more technology, because we really have, as one of the earlier economic surveys had talked about, we have not 20, not 100, but we have several tens of thousands of agricultural markets which are not integrated with each other. As a result, the farmer actually is it doesn't have enough options.
No, but all
except
of this
basically go to the
was
local
also
mandi.
the case.
This is what we have to actually
Sajjid
focus
Chinoy,
on. I think
when the BJP promised in 2013, 2014 that it would double farm income by 2022, a promise that's now not being spoken of at all. It's almost as if that promise was never made. Now the question is, and Dr. Krishnamurthy is right when he says that there are structural problems. Just generating farm output is not enough. You have to take it to the consumer. The farmer has to have better mechanisms. All that may be true, but this is a promise that was made when you went to the voters in the last election, and therefore the government will be held accountable when data suggests that that promise is not being kept. Sajjid Chinoy.
Now, let me take your larger question actually about a more holistic assessment of the last few years, which is how much of this is global, how much of this is domestic. I think it's a bit of both. I think, let's just put this in perspective. When the economy was growing around 9% between 2004 and 2009, exports grew at 18% a year in real terms for 5 successive years. The last 5 years, exports have grown at 4%. So given the share of exports in the economy, that slowdown itself is responsible for a couple of percentage points of headline GDP growth slowing. So the government has faced a rather adverse global economy, offset in part by the fact that oil prices are down, and that's provided some fillip to growth in India. There have also been domestic reasons. I agree with Dr. Subramanian here that when you do big structural reform, that the deleveraging in the banking system that's been underway in the last few years, cleaning up our public sector banks, asset resolution, these do extract short-term growth impacts, and we've seen that it's only last year that credit growth has actually picked up, similarly with the GST. So I think it's a combination of a slightly more hostile global environment, the fact that reforms have happened here which are dislocational. But Rahul, to your point, on agriculture, I think it's more important to look forward and accept the following fact, that given productivity levels in agriculture, we will have to emulate what China did. I don't think these problems can be fixed by higher support prices or doubling incomes, because A, that's economically not very viable, and B, would be very inflationary if that income growth does not keep up with productivity growth. So in a way, what we're saying is we have to dramatically improve productivity growth rates in agriculture, which are not economically feasible. We've seen around the world. What we need to do is create a demand push for jobs outside agriculture, in industry, in services that are labor intensive, so that people can gradually migrate from lower productivity agricultural jobs to slightly higher productivity, both formal and informal jobs in industry and services. I think that has to be the game plan.
Arun Kumar,
going forward.
You cannot take away the fact that the government has faced serious global headwinds when it comes to global trade. The trade war between China and the United
Yes.
States makes it much worse.
Correct.
The United States bearing down on India on various
Yes.
trade terms is problematic as well. Therefore, when you look at slowing GDP numbers, you have to look at it in the larger context of the problem. Sajjid Chinoy argues that takes off at least 2% from your headline GDP numbers.
Fair enough, but the problem is we had two big shocks. Let's not forget that. And those big two shocks affected the unorganized sector, and that's 94% of your employment. And that also links up to your problem of agriculture, because if 94% people lose incomes, then the demand for food goes down, and your stocks are built not because people are eating enough. Women and children, 40% are malnourished.
Okay, DK
If they were
Joshi,
to
do you
eat more-
agree with Arun Kumar's
if they were to eat
assessment
more,
that
the
yes,
demand-
there are these headwinds, but we also shot ourselves in the foot with demonetization particularly, and if we hadn't, then the situation would not have been as bad as it is, because crude oil prices for the large part of 5 years have been moderate. We would have still been able to ensure that the economy was chugging along at a fast clip.
Well, I think it would have added
Was
some
that
bit
question
to the
for me?
economy, but I think from a sticking to the external side, I think the what
DK Joshi.
hello. Yeah, so what hit the exporting sector? See, what happened to exports was that we could not take advantage of the global pickup in trade, which was temporary but did happen in 2017 because our exporters could not get their refunds in time. So they were not. We could not take full advantage. And later on, I think that the trade as well as the global growth started slowing down. So I think. So that was the cost of initial glitches in GST. Now I think a broader issue is that going ahead, what happens? I mean, the global trade is going to be in flux, and I think we'll have to look more inwards. I mean, to promote growth, which leads us to a question that how to enhance efficiency, productivity in the system, and that boils down to reforms. I mean, which means that whatever has been started and is work in progress, I think that needs to be carried forward. I think that to me is the only way of
Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, before you became Chief Economic Advisor, you were one of the macroeconomists who actually backed and continue to be a strong advocate of demonetization. Many economists like Sajjid Chinoy argue that it's taken off at least 2% of our GDP numbers. That's what Manmohan Singh said as well. Now that you are where you are, do you concede that demonetization was one of the major triggers that slowed down the India growth story, that we would have possibly been better off without demo than with it?
So let me focus on a couple of aspects here. If we notice we've been able to identify close to 360,000 shell companies. And remember, and this is some of my research have actually been finding that it's the shell companies, the related party transactions that are done with shell companies and using shell companies that accounts for what I actually call the Brahma Vishnu Mahesh, which is you have money laundering, tax evasion, and willful default, and neither of these three are actually are salutary for the economy. Now this is something that has happened actually post demonetization. We've also been able to identify several sources of undisclosed income. Let's recognize, and what an economist always talks about is that there are no benign options. Economists always have two hands, on the one hand, on the other hand, and even if you look at projects that corporates do, that the benefits accrue over time. Any investment project that a firm does, it does not reap the benefit in just one go. It reaps it over time, and I will emphasize that again.
You're watching the Big India Today Economists Roundtable. The question I'm going to pose to all our guests now is India suffering from jobless growth, or is the system of job data generation fundamentally wrong? Joining us on this special Economists Roundtable, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Chief Economic Advisor in the Government of India, DK Joshi, Chief Economist at CRISIL, Sajjid Chinoy, Chief India Economist at JP Morgan, PC Mohanan, former Acting Chairperson of the National Statistical Commission, Arun Kumar, Economist and author, and Rajeev Dubey, Managing Editor, Business Today. I want to go across to Mr. Mohanan first, who stepped down from the National Statistical Commission because data that he and his team had generated had not been made public. Mr. Mohanan, the government will argue with some merit that the manner in which job data has been generated over the past few decades doesn't fully account for job creation in the present and also in the past. Therefore, till the time you fix the data, coming up with headline numbers that suggest that unemployment is at a 4.5-decade high make no sense. Arun Jaitley told us that if unemployment was indeed at a 4.5-decade high, there would have been riots on the street. There are no riots. The GDP is still growing at amongst the fastest rates in the world, suggesting that job data is not as bad as you and some of the others might have us believe.
Well, thank you. See, let me tell you first that we don't change anything in the methodology of collecting the job data. The NSSO, which produces the job data, they have done almost similar exercise in the past, and so nothing much has changed in the way the data are generated. So to say that the data generation process is not right to capture all the job generated is not right. So all that the NSSO did is to try to produce some high frequency numbers, like some quarterly numbers for the urban area and annual numbers for the country as a whole. Now this was the effort, so nothing much has changed in the methodology or the system that produces the survey or the conceptual basis for measuring employment and unemployment. So that is the first point. But the government, we thought, is not comfortable with the numbers that came up in the report, and probably that was the only reason why the report was not released.
Now, Krishnamurthy Subramanian, this has never happened in India before. Chinese government data has been globally derided because there was a sense that they inflate the numbers. Indian data, so far at least, was respected worldwide. Now that seems to be changing. Many global money managers have their own index where they're looking at different markers to determine how fast they believe the Indian economy is growing. They're not believing government data. Let me give a non-economic example. There's a lot wrong with the manner in which the CBSE comes up with the 12th Standard Board results. Yes, by all means you can fix it, but it doesn't mean that because you don't like the manner in which the evaluation has been done so far, you stop declaring CBSE results. Fix it along the way by all means. You can't stop giving the government's report card. Mr. Mohanan argues you did this because you didn't like what your report card showed you. Dr. Subramanian.
So first, now I've been in the government for the last 4 months now. And one of the things that has really struck me is the strength of our democracy, which is the number of touch points thereof of policy making. And therefore, I actually remain totally convinced that it is very difficult to develop a narrative that is anything but the truth. Because the number of touch points thereof of policy. So I actually will, emphatically say that, while there might be we may have to, calibrate a little bit on some of these aspects, but I will, definitely say that there is absolutely no motive behind any of this. Now let me come to the specifics. On the employment numbers, I think there's a lot of misinformation here which one must correct. Number one, across the world, if you look at it, what is called the elasticity of employment to economic growth, that has been going down because of technological reasons. So the unemployment number net in the economy itself does not make that much sense, because one has to open the hood and really look at sectors that create jobs and sectors that are losing jobs, number one. And that's something which, a phenomenon that is happening worldwide, in India as well. Second, what is important to keep in mind is that if you compare the employment-unemployment survey and the periodic labor force survey, those are apples and oranges. Because, in terms of the sampling, the PLFS actually samples households based on the level of education. In particular, it samples households based on the number of individuals who have passed class 10. And 75% of that sample is those households who have at least one individual who has passed class 10. Now remember very well, if I have cleared class 10, I will not go and work as a daily wage laborer. And if you think about then putting 75% weight versus a 25% weight and utilize the census data, what that data tells us about the rates of unemployment between those households that have nobody clearing class 10th and somebody, and at least one individual, you will actually get a higher rate. That's important to keep in mind when we talk about. Now let me, on the last part on the GDP data, let me in moving from the previous series to the current series, we have actually expanded the sample universe significantly because the MCA data comes in a lot more frequently. Also, if you look at what is called the blow-up factor,
comprises is not known. Researchers argue that the data should be made transparent and public so that it can be vetted externally. Now, what constitutes your database is not known. Therefore, when the NSSO comes out and says that 1/3 of the companies are shell companies, that leads one to wonder whether what we are basing the GDP numbers on at all is fundamentally strong or not, Dr. Subramanian.
I think again there are two important points that need to be made here. Number one, I think we need to make a distinction between the level of GDP and the growth rate of GDP. Okay, even if one supposes that there is some over or underestimation in the level of the GDP, it does not immediately imply that there is actually an impact on the growth rate, because you're talking about, if suppose the growth rates of those companies that are available and those that are not available, if those growth rates remain the same and the percentage of companies that does not change, then it mathematically follows that the growth rate will not be affected. Second point, what is important to keep in mind here is that if you look at what is called the blow-up factors, the proportion of companies that are available for estimation and those that are not available for estimation, over the last 5 to 6 years, those that are not available constitute anywhere between 12 to 15% in terms of the paid up capital. So the actual impact on the GDP growth rate itself is very, very marginal. Okay, and the third point to remember, which is important, is that some of the conversation that has happened is based on the survey of service sector that is being done based on the samples that is taken from the MCA firms. Now, if
Arun Kumar, I asked the Prime Minister this question. He argued with great passion and with some merit that the manner in which
Rahul, let me complete.
Okay, go on, sir.
Rahul, can I complete?
Yes.
Let me complete that, because it's an important point that the services sector, if you go and sample for the services sector, if that firm is not in the services, or let's say that firm has, for some reason, it has, let's say, changed its address, that does not mean that that firm is not in the economy, that it does not count when you calculate the GDP. These are very important, but subtle points that must be kept in mind so that we actually do not make misinformed interpretations about this.
Arun Kumar, when I asked the Prime Minister this question, he argued with some merit that the manner in which job data has historically been generated in this country simply doesn't account for how the nature of job creation is changing, and therefore he says all this while we've been looking at meaningless data. All we've done is taken a pause to come up with a job series that is meaningful and relevant to the current times.
So, it shouldn't be ad hoc. There should be a committee which should be able to devise a new methodology if that's what we want. But till then, we have to use the data as it has come. And it's a household data where everything is covered. So whether it be cab drivers, whether it be delivery boys, they're all included as part of the household data. Now the question is, where else is job being lost? So certainly in these areas, jobs are being generated, but elsewhere the jobs are being lost. So that's the point, that we should do it after preparation. It shouldn't be ad hoc.
Sajjid Chinoy.
But one point about the GDP, I would like to point out, we started in 2012 with about 5 lakh companies. Today we have 18 lakh companies. The universe of companies under MCA 21 is increasing, and the multiplier, the markup that we are doing for the companies that are not reporting, that is not based on the way the shell companies work. So therefore, if we have lost out certain number of companies because they've been either removed from the database or because they're not existing, then the markups have to change. This blowing up factor, that becomes very important, and that changes the nature of GDP and the growth of GDP
also
both.
For job jobs, let's not forget that EPFO's own numbers are showing a decline. They are showing a decline on average job creation since EPFO started reporting them. So it's a 26% decline since October of last year to now. So that's also
and the
an
government
indicator.
itself initially said, look at EPFO data, look at how jobs are being created month on month. Now that same series that the government brought into currency is suggesting an adverse picture.
It's itself being revised downwards from September 17
Sajjid Chinoy, are you looking less seriously at the data that the Indian government is putting out? Is it correct to say that global money managers are now looking at their own economic metrics, and like China, the credibility of Indian public data is now suspect?
Rahul, Indian data has been very good, and I don't think global managers have reached a point where they're creating their own indices. I think the real question is the one you asked in the beginning, which is about growth in jobs and whether we've had jobless growth. I think what's a little bit unfortunate, and this is true of the last 30 years, not just the last 5, is that we're fundamentally labor-abundant economy. But if you look at our growth in the last 3 decades, it's been very capital intensive. Just take our export basket. 15 years ago, 70% of our exports was leather, textile, gems and jewelry, very labor intensive. Today, more than 50% is very capital intensive. Automobile parts, engineering goods, pharmaceuticals, capital goods. Essentially what's happened is, and this is true in other parts of the world as well, the relative cost of labor compared to capital is too high in India. And therefore the capital intensity in manufacturing and organized manufacturing is way too high for a country like India. There is a lot of research on this that's proved this. In fact, I would say, the labor intensity has fallen by a factor of 5 in the last 30 years. This is happening for 2 reasons. One is that the relative cost of machines with the advent of technology has come down all over the world. But at the same time, if you look at, in India's case, education, lack of skills, health, labor frictions, labor law constraints, the productivity adjusted cost of labor is very high. So for me, the key issue is not just what growth is going to be or what investment is going to be. The key issue is, can we work on health, education, skills, labor laws to make labor a more attractive factor of production? If we don't do that, we can have a decade of 7% growth, but we won't create the kind of jobs that China created. So again, data issues apart, looking forward for the next administration, the focus has to be what are the package of measures that makes labor more attractive when an entrepreneur decides to
but those are tough bullets to bite.
Production.
We saw what happened when the government tried to move the Land Acquisition Act. There was a huge political uproar. Dr. Subramanian, we don't know if you'd be in the saddle when there's a new government that comes, but do you believe as an economist, as Sajjid Chinoy argues, that unless you reform labor, you simply cannot create the set of conditions that will create double-digit growth? The last time the government tried to bite a tough bullet on land acquisition, there was such a strong blowback that after that the government, the Modi Sarkar at least, didn't even attempt to go down that road.
No, I think the issues that Dr. Sajjid Chinoy is raising are well known and they are valid. We certainly have to focus on, and I've said it elsewhere as well, that the factors of production, which is land, labor, and capital, we have to focus on ensuring that the costs of those factors of production are actually reduced, because that in turn will then contribute to our competitiveness. So labor in particular, for instance, and what Dr. Chinoy was saying is that when you adjust for the productivity, the cost of labor is indeed high, and that is because of the frictions that we've created through, in many ways. For instance, we have, if you look at the minimum wage laws across, all of India, we have close to 2,000 minimum wages. Some states, have basically 80 minimum wages just within them, and these are some things that actually then create a lot of frictions, which affects the relative, productivity of labor vis-a-vis capital. general. So I quite agree that we have to focus on job creation. And the last point, actually, we have to focus on job creation. I've been saying this many years with earlier as well, that just growth will not create jobs, because across the world the elasticity of jobs of employment to economic growth has been falling, and therefore we need to be focusing on jobs separately from economic growth, because that is the best form of inclusion.
Okay, DK Joshi, final words. Do you believe the government is correcting a faulty method of data generation, or do you think the government's actions have actually corroded the faith of India's public data?
Well, I think the process that was adopted was an improvement over the previous process, and it is stabilizing. I think once it stabilizes, I think we will have more confidence in it. I mean, so right now I think it is in the process of stabilizing, and I think I think if I may just add to the jobs part. I mean, I believe that I agree with Sajjid that the job intensity of growth is coming down. So I think that's precisely the reason why we need to focus on segments which are labor intensive right now. And there is an opportunity from the global side. I mean, despite trade wars, despite the tensions, I think what's been happening over the last few years is that China has been shedding labor intensive jobs, and I think they labor intensive activities like textiles, etc. And I mean, we have not been able to capture that market. That market has gone to Vietnam and Bangladesh. So clearly, I think we need to improve competitiveness, and that there not only labor is an issue, but there are other parts of competitiveness, from logistics to better availability of raw materials, the electricity. I think all these things come together.
Okay,
and I
so I'm out of time on this Economist Roundtable.
Second, I think is health and education. I think these are labor-intensive segments.
We've had a high-quality, structured conversation, not the kind of tutu meme that we often see on television. And I'm very thankful to all our guests for having put forth very incisive, sharp perspectives. You've heard different points of view on the state of the Indian economy. Which side you're likely to believe more, we leave to you to decide. For the time being, to all our guests, Dr. Krishnamurthy Subramanian, Sajjid Chinoy, PC Mohanan, Arun Kumar, and DK Joshi. Thank you very much. Thanks also to Rajeev from Business Today. We're slipping into a quick break. I hope you enjoyed the Economist Roundtable. This is the kind of high-quality, structured conversations we like to put forth for you. Thank you for tuning in. I look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. Goodbye.
Thanks for watching the video. For more such news and updates, please like, share and subscribe to India Today. Also check out our other great videos from our channel. We know you would love to.